say thank you so much first for acknowledging history the way that I've learned history, for making sure we know that Christ is not Jesus's last name, and that it is a power, and that the Bible, King James Bible, not so accurate. To bring it back, now that we have a basic understanding of how epigenetics plays out in our history and in our today and in our now, doing that work to elevate my ancestors and doing that work to process makes me feel like a more whole person, makes me have more compassionate responses. It makes unity, love, and connection my more natural trigger of reaction. It made me decide that I wanted to become a more kind person. I didn't want to take out my anger through vengeance or vindictiveness because it didn't work. It just left me feeling actually in more of a victim state, because the only reason I needed to be vengeful and vindictive is because I felt powerless and I wanted to regain my power. But I was really giving whoever harmed me the power to have harmed me by saying how shitty they were and that they should be punished. Because that was in my own psychological time that I was feeling like, oh, they are so terrible and I'm so stupid for whatever those stories played out. So in doing that work with myself, I feel like I've been able to establish more of a connection with my ancestors. How do you see that playing out in Eurocentric people, or like, so if there's been such an extreme culture erasure, what do you see as the solution?
Yeah, great question. I also, by the way, would love to hear more about your process of working with the ancestors and of accessing those lineages and healing some of that trauma. So let's talk about that too. But just to answer your question, and I'll try to be as succinct as possible. It's a big question, but I think there are several approaches that have to be taken simultaneously. One, we always begin from where we are, right? So we can't, it makes no sense to be anachronistic and to wish for some different history than the one that we actually have, and to try to go outside of this time and contrivedly bring some other time into being here and now. It just doesn't work. So I think being realistic about what we've inherited, where we are, and the constructs that we have, and then doing two things simultaneously. One, finding the threads in the constructs we currently have, for example, in the church, in Catholic Christianity in the West, finding the little threads in there, like we were talking about earlier, that do actually carry a stream of ancestral wisdom that is not 100% traumatized. I mean, it's largely traumatized, but we need to get in there and find the bits that aren't traumatized and capitalize on those, so to speak, and pull out that wisdom and follow those threads back as far as we can. Then the other thing that I think we need to do simultaneous to that is go back to the really, really ancient ancestors and to what we have left of our mythic and folkloric traditions. And this, by the way, I think is recommendable for all people. It doesn't matter who you are on the planet. Like, I think we're at a state now where dominator culture and the socioeconomic norms of dominator culture in the West have so saturated the world and have destroyed so many cultural environments that, like, almost everyone now needs to do this work to some degree. It's just that Western peoples need to do it more probably than anybody else. But I think everybody needs to do it to some degree. To go back to the ancient ancestors, what are the surviving myths that we have? What are the folk tales? What are the customs and traditions that go back before the adoption of Christianity and before all these unhealthful patterns began? And pull those forward in an intelligent, meaningful, non-anachronistic way, right? So not in a silly way. Like, anachronistic means doing something that is awkwardly drawn from a past time, basically. So you know, like if you think about the Renaissance Fair or role playing or something like that, where people try to put on a costume of some former time because they're nostalgic for a time that they never knew, right? At least in this lifetime. And so not doing that. And by the way, I'm not saying that, you know, people shouldn't go to the Renaissance Fair or whatever, that's fine. But not taking that kind of approach, which is ultimately fairly silly by comparison to what we need to do. The work we need to do is serious work. And so going back and intelligently, with intellective veracity and with respect and integrity, beginning to bring back some of these customs and traditions and ask how they might really fit into our world now, and make the constructs we do have vulnerable to revision from the reclamation of those earlier things, if that makes sense.
What I heard you say was the more that people build connection with their heritage in whatever small way possible, because of so much culture erasure, the less we'll have these racialized societies and dominator culture.
I think that's partly true. I also think it's important, though, to be clear that when we're talking about cultural reclamation, we're talking about something that's transcendent of race. So it's not a racial issue per se, it's a cultural issue. And so I don't think, for instance, to illustrate what I mean, so in America, right, most white people in America, not all certainly, but most, have some often untraceable admixture of lineages in a genetic or racial sense, right? Like if you ask people, oh, what's your ancestral origins or what have you, then they'll say, oh, I don't know. I mean, I think I'm German and English and a little bit Swedish and Spanish, and there's a little African in there, and there's some Native American, you know, like it's a melange, right? It's so diversified. And that's okay. But what I think we need to avoid and be careful to guard against in this reclamation work is people saying like, oh, well, you know, you can't, for example, if I said, as somebody rooted in my own ancestral cultures, which are Celtic, I'm, I guess, in a way fortunate that I have very clear lineages that are Scottish, Irish, and Welsh, and really nothing else, like that much Swedish, and that's it, you know. But if I said, for example, to somebody who has German heritage, no, you can't be part of what I'm doing because you're not Celtic, you're German. That's not the way. That's not how we need to proceed. I think we need to ask broader questions about, you know, different modes of European cultural inheritance, and ask at a soul level where people are feeling drawn in this reclamation work. And it may be that, you know, somebody who has no relationship to in fact, this often occurs, somebody who has no relationship in a physical or racial sense to my particular ancestral inheritance feels really drawn at a soul level into Celtic cultures and traditions. And I welcome them in with open arms in that case, right? So I think it's important that we're not drawing racial lines.
I had a client who had some Celtic ancestors that wouldn't leave me alone for trying to get them to connect with them, like, you know. And every time I would see this client, it was like, did you connect with them yet? And they're like, no, I haven't got it, because they keep bothering me, and now they're telling you it'll be bad for you if you don't. But I had that happen as an experience, and for me, with my moonbeam, if I'm not paying, so I'm claircognizant, meaning that I just know stuff. So if I'm not paying attention to the feeling and insight that comes along with the thought, it could be just another thought and gone away. But when I'm being present to the feeling and the insight that comes along with it, that's what, like, so there's this trust that what I'm saying has value that has to come up.
Yeah.
But there was repeated like Celtic, 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 please connect. They really want you. And she was a Black woman.
Mm. Yeah. And yeah, so that's, I mean, and those things happen for various reasons. I think because of the genetic lineages that are there sometimes, and also for metaphysical reasons that we can't limit and really rationally frame, right? Because we don't necessarily have the adequate understanding to speak to those things. I mean, who am I to say what someone's soul lineage is? I mean, that's, you know, it's
Love my favorite.
in my worldview, incarnation is just or excuse me, I'll use the proper metaphysical term, transmigration of souls. So the appearance of souls in many different forms in many different worlds over a potentially infinite amount of time, that's a given in my ancestral worldview. So my assumption is, who the hell knows what people's soul lineages are, and they may be connected to various tribes of souls, councils of ancestors that, you know, I share in, for example, even if they are not related at all to my ancestral lineages in this particular incarnation. So I think we have to always be mindful of that level of things as well, and not fall into the trap of getting caught up in racial designations and, you know, drawing lines in the sand around those kinds of things. I think that's also an important part.
That sometimes is very tough.
Mm-hmm.
And it is very tough because as I connect and commune with my ancestors, I haven't really gotten a chance to know what their, you know, what their race would be. But for as many generations as I can see back, there is some white in there, but I don't know what kind of white. And there's a lot of Black people. But that's just, you know, 4 or 5 generations back. That has nothing to do with way back or different soul lineages. But I say this frequently, like my higher self, my soul self, and my Black body are frequently at odds.
Mm.
Right? Like the soul's here for a mission. I'm here for a shared future. I definitely want to be a bridge and want to have create a space where we all can be ourselves and fully self-actualize and express.
Yeah.
And where people don't have to worry about physical survival needs. But then when in accepting things the way that they are in the physical realm, I can't separate myself from my race.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is hard for me and then there is a fear of empowering white people who don't want to deal with the trauma to then say, oh, I don't see race, I don't see color. It's a mindset thing. It's all about you. So while I understand completely and my soul mind agree with what you're saying, I can't agree that it's not important to heal racialized trauma or to deal with things as a racialized trauma in the racialized world as it is today.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And this is where the tension comes, right? Because how do we do a both and on this? Like, how do we hold, as Keats once said, hold things in negative capability, hold two seemingly opposing things together harmoniously without an irritable grasping at reason to define them, right? So like we have to honor both of these realities and hold them in productive tension. And I think one of the ways in which what you were just naming becomes really crucial is when we get into a discussion of cultural appropriation, especially with cultural groups that have been colonized and oppressed, and in some cases, you know, nearly destroyed. I mean, I think a really easy example on this landscape is Indigenous American cultures, so many of whom have been brought to the verge of just like total destruction. Their languages are being lost, and I mean, that's a whole other conversation, which needs to be had more, I think, in this environment that we're in
Like,
America.
how dare we not on their land?
Yeah, right. So, but so many people will use what we were just talking about a few moments ago in terms of the metaphysical dimension of all this that has to be accounted for. So many people, if they're not rooted in the realities of embodied existence appropriately, they'll just default to the metaphysical and say, well, I might be English, but I'm going to be a Native American, and then you get into dangerous modes of appropriation, which are, by the way, I think related back to the noble savage phenomena that I was discussing. There's a sense in which people who have been decultured, who have been whitewashed, who have become cultural orphans, are longing at an unconscious level for something that can connect them to the land, something that can connect them to their own deep roots. And if they don't find the tools in what's around them, often, if they're not conscious of these dynamics that we're discussing, they'll just go to whatever's at hand, Native Americans or whatever it is, right? And say, I'm going to pull from these traditions. I'm going to appropriate these things because this is all mostly unconscious for people, but they perceive that as a doorway into healing. Well, unfortunately, it's not a doorway into healing in that case, because not only is it not going to heal your own ancestral trauma, but it's actually going to, unbeknownst to you, even if your intentions are good, it's going to continue the colonization process on that culture and destroy that culture more that you're appropriating. So I think that's a really dangerous thing. And so to your point, absolutely, we have to hold both of these things together, and it's not easy. How do we make spiritual and intellective sense of these things when they're being held together in tension? I think it requires wisdom, to go back to something we talked about earlier. It requires constant discernment and compassion, and also appropriate critical thinking. We have to be willing to call bullshit when we see it in ourselves and around us. But we also have to have the spaciousness and the compassion to be able to navigate these difficult waters, all of us, together in one form or another. But I do think, so while I think all of the qualifications we named about the metaphysical dimensions stand, and those are important, simultaneously, I also very strongly affirm that we each have our own work to do right here, right now, in the bodies that we're in. And we need to own our own shit and do that work, and tend to our own inheritances, whatever those are. And if it's complicated, then sift it out, find out what's in there. And if you can't find out outwardly, like sometimes people will ask me, because I guide folks in this kind of ancestral healing work, and sometimes people will come and they'll say, but I don't know, I was adopted, or I grew up in a family where nobody knew anything and whatever. And of course there's, what is it called? The thing where you send in your, ancestry.com, there's all that stuff.
Yeah.
And that's one dimension of it. But even barring that, I mean, what we do have, as long as we are able to come into communion with people who have these skills, what we do have is the ability to go internally in our deep unconscious landscapes and in the spiritual landscape, in what in my tradition we would call the other world, the unseen, and to do work in that realm. And that's really, really needful work that's related to our direct lineages, but in the unseen, where we can actually contact the ancestors and form relationships with them, whoever they happen to be. So I think that the tools are available, and there's no excuse to not do the work, even if it's difficult.
So I agree with you wholeheartedly on that. It's hard, but we can do it. And it is worthy and worth it work. And as a person who has done some of my own work, it is transformational, from an embodied inside out. Like, the world as you reflect it out is different. The world that reflects back to you is different and feels safer and better and more inclusive and has more of a sense of belonging. But as we were talking about epigenetic instructions, some of so I know that it is in me to be afraid when white people get uncomfortable.
Mm. Yeah.
And that is because of the power dynamics of society, how and it's not to say that I feel like white anger or that visceral reaction is different than I find in my own culture in a disagreement. I'm not saying that. It's just that there aren't as many consequences and a lot more of permissible atrocities, or like it's a lot easier for people to go further faster to harm me.
Yeah.
So it's safer for me to survive. Like, so fawn, not like I can't say not any so much anymore because I've done my work, but fawning is a fear response, right? Let me make you feel comfortable so then you no longer are a threat to me because you're in your comfortable state, as opposed to I said that to say that if that's the case generationally, I know I'm not the only Black person that feels this way. I've read about it in books. I've met other people. That's some of the work that I help people unpack when I'm working with BIPOC clients, is that being your authentic version of yourself and being that in an active way, even in a racialized society. But so like if white comfort is bred in white people and not confronting things and making sure you stay, I heard this was a friend's daughter who is white described white culture as appropriate. Like as long as you behave appropriately, then you get access to society's safety. Like, how do you get that person to say, okay, I want to do the hard work and reclaim my heritage, my ancestral connection? And even though, and as a person who's cried snot and tears, had horrible metaphysical disappointments because of of energies that were locked in my own body as attraction points, how do you get them to keep going and still keep pointing in the positive direction?
It's a great question, Alexis, and I struggle with this. I struggle to find the answer to this question. And it's a question that I ask passionately all the time, and often feel frustrated by. And I'll say too that, you know, being a priest, working in church contexts, parish contexts specifically, in the Episcopal Church, which is a very white, mainline denomination and kind of subcultural group, there's so much comfort in those realms with the way that things are, and there's so much apathy that it's very, very difficult in many, especially, and I'm not downing anyone here, and I have to qualify this as a priest, that I love all those people. I love them to death, you know, and I want to love them into transformation, but it's not always possible because sometimes folks, especially of older generations who are in that sociocultural position, are just content to sit where they are and rest on their laurels, so to speak, and not do the work. And no matter what you do or how hard you shake them or how hard you rattle the bars of their worldview prison that they're unknowingly in, they will not wake up out of that sleep, that apathy. So I think, you know, part of this is just human nature in a lot of ways, because unfortunately, when human beings get comfortable, they like those comfortable patterns and they want to stay in them, you know, and they don't really want to work hard. So you take that kind of baseline thing, and then you add all the white privilege on that, and then you add on the associated economic privilege, and then you add on the conditioning of a mass consumeristic non-culture, which basically tells us that it's all about what we can materialistically acquire, and we want and should have the fast food version of everything, right? So if you can't tell me in 5 simple sentences how to fix it, then piss off, because I've got you know, I got to go watch my reality TV show or whatever, right? So it's all these things are compounded. So it's very, very difficult. And I'm the last person who will say that it's easy or accessible. It's really, really difficult to break people out of these molds, these worldview molds that they're trapped in. It is possible, but it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier in the conversation. I think a lot of it is about the readiness of someone's psyche and the readiness ultimately of their soul. And when you find those people for whom the work is possible because they're really ready for it, then it is possible to guide those folks forward and get some really amazing work done. And the hope I take in that, even though it's a small percentage of the whole population that's willing to go there, the hope I take in that is that I do think that even small groups of people doing this kind of work and creating a catalytic situation of change, an environment of transformation around themselves, that does make an impact. And we have to do the work, even though it's really easy to say, oh man, this is a hopeless cause, just forget it. You know, I mean, that's a really easy path to take, but it's morally abhorrent. You know, we have to do this work for so many reasons, for issues or reasons around racial justice, for reasons relating to just basic internal wholeness and health, for reasons relating to ecologic justice. I mean, part of this too, and this is maybe for another conversation, but part of this, the dominator style of culture that we are unfortunately inhabiting and inhabited by in this setting is also not just a negation of indigenous lifeways and people groups and non-white people groups, but it's also a negation of the feminine, and it's a negation of the earth and the sanctity and the sovereignty of the living earth. And all these things are tied up together, in my view. They're not actually, even though we can talk about them as separate issues, they're all deeply interrelated. So there's a huge amount of work to be done, and it can be discouraging, but what the hell are we here for if not to do this work? You know, I mean,
to eat all the fast food and reality TV we can. What do you mean? And be comfortable as can be and have purposeless lives.
oh
What are we
God.
here for? To have sex, make babies, and teach them to be consumers.
Right, right.
Oh, I mean, don't get it twisted. I like the sex. But not the baby. Well, I like babies. I just don't have any. Your answer wasn't necessarily hope-filled.
I know, I'm sorry. Sometimes I think the only thing we can do is just be transparent and honest, you know. I mean,
Well, I found a solution though.
Okay, good. What is it?
The people you're talking about,
Yeah.
you mentioned that they're old.
Well, not all of them, but
okay. Well, the old ones are the ones I found a solution for, okay? Because they're going to be an ancestor shortly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just do the work there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
go and then we'll do the work, and maybe it, you know.
I like that. Yeah. I mean, part of me, it's also tempting to think, well, once these couple of generations die off in the next 10, 15, 20 years or whatever, we might have a reset and we might actually be able to do some of this stuff on a larger scale. It's tempting to think that way. And I think there may be an element of truth in that, just in a practical sense. But at the same time, that's also potentially a really destructive perspective, because it could allow us to become apathetic ourselves and just say, well, we're just hanging out waiting for all these people to die and then it's all going to be fine. because if the younger generations don't have the necessary formation and preparation to do the work, then it doesn't really matter, because all that shit's going to just keep getting handed down, right?
I feel like, so idea, so there was the boomers are depression babies, right? So then we're going to have all these COVID babies. Because poor people got to be stuck in the house. And when you're stuck in the house, what do? You're bored, you have sex. So you have the baby, and then you have the babies. So we're going to have all these COVID babies.
Mm-hmm.
But the COVID babies are being gestated in this energy of divisiveness.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't, well, dang it, this isn't necessarily hope-filling either, but if we don't do this work, they are going to have a predisposition to divisiveness simply for being in this energy field and being gestated during this time.
That could be. Yeah. I hope not, but it's possible. Yeah, it's possible.
So what are we going to do, Brendan?
Well, let me ask you. I want to go back to a question that I wanted to discuss with you around kind of the practical dimensions of the ancestral work and how that's unfolded for you and how that's looked in your experience to connect in those ways and do some of that healing work.
So I'm trying to figure out how much I want to say.
Yeah, sure.
So I keep an ancestor altar.
Mm-hmm.
But mine started out very, very much a self-awakening, not necessarily an awakening to the ancestral realm.
Mm-hmm.
I had my own awakening, which isn't necessarily a story I've put out, but eventually I know that it's coming out. I desire for it to come out, but we've been talking for a while now. So I had where I had the experiential knowledge. We talked about it, that I guess that integration of
Mm-hmm.
my thoughts coupled with how I feel about them, with the amount of data, mental the knowledge I hold in my head, and my ability to dream,
Mm-hmm.
literally shape my reality, literally reflect the world back to me the way that it lives in me.
Mm-hmm.
So I had that experience, but in that experience, what I call it is like I vibrated on love. And that's like this opium feeling. And I've never done opium, so I'm just, but it's addictive.
Yeah.
And so with that, in understanding that what is in me is reflected back to me, that was my motivation for beginning to rewire my mind.
Mm-hmm.
It was really magical for a period of months, I guess, so I could get acclimated to the reality of its effect. And then I had the tenacity to try to manifest my deepest desire based on trauma. And it was like a thud. When I went to get the data in my mind, it was blank, does not compute. There's nothing there. Mm. And that was quite jarring in and of itself. And that started my journey of trying to figure out what connection felt like. And then along that journey, different things happened and I got introduced to different people and different religious teachers. And so I began studying African traditional religions. And from there, what I understood was, so first of all, my view is that all religions are systems of spirituality. But because thoughts turn into things, all of those realms are real too, right? No matter what system of spirituality, what system of mysticism, or whatever it is, because humans who were thinking individuals reflecting that out thought it at some position in space or time, it has a place where it exists as real and true. So I decided to select for efficiency because at first it was, oh no, Alexa's gonna come up with everything because of her fierce independence. So I'm gonna come up with my own rituals. I'm gonna supercharge these words. But it was just because I understood how it worked and I didn't care for the world the way it was. Um, and then it was like, this shit's hard and I'm not successful at it. So I decided to select a spiritual system to begin to pursue, because I also understood that those words were already charged for centuries.
Yeah.
Like, why do I have to do it? I don't have to reinvent the wheel. Frankly, I didn't invent this wheel anyway. So I can just like play along and get along, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so from that, I sometimes crack up at the way that my higher self had to convince this body to participate in spirituality. It was a lot of trickery, okay? But from that, I understood that I would connect, that the moonbeam, that my downloads came from my ancestors, or Egun, as they're called in my practices. But then in unpacking that trauma mind, so the way that I explain it is like, wherever you wake up, like how you said we start from where we are, it's like on a number line. So you got negative infinity here, you got positive infinity here, and then the world you're manifesting is swirling around that whole number line. So if I woke up over here in negative infinity, I still got to go through the world I'm manifesting as I move closer to zero. And in dealing with different disappointments while still recognizing that I reflect my reality out to me, I began to go inward with those disappointments instead of seeing myself as a victim. Like, okay, so if this is what happens, where is this in my mind? Where is this in my... Then I would have these weird imageries pop up, like where I would see faces on DNA strands in my mind's eye. And when I would begin to identify some of the, like, I keep doing like this, but that's just because that's my heart center. But like, you have a thought, you have a releasing feeling that goes along with it if you're metabolizing it, right? So it's hard to say, and I'm trying to say it in general terms so I don't tell the world all my personal business. But not that I'm not bad at that. I'm constantly oversharing. So shame was a feeling that wasn't necessarily mine in this life. It doesn't mean that I didn't experience it because it was in my DNA. But this particular type of shame that attracted this particular type of event wasn't. It was before me. But I didn't know that until I was processing from a conscious awareness place the pain of this event. And so just like I have what I call shiny thoughts or awarenesses that happen, once I hit the place where it was, I call them expansive thoughts, really. It was like, the knowledge of what it is became in my awareness. And then because I see readers and healers, it was confirmed to me. That is an example. I am a person who has been through in my lifetime a lot of trauma. So there was a lot of things to have a lot of experiences that happen like that and have their own stories. But for me, through the keeping of my altar, through the doing the assignments of my spiritual advisor, through the sitting in the feeling instead of trying to alleviate the feeling, came the knowledge and the breakthroughs. And then trusting that that will happen over time and seeing the effects over time in my lived experience is what is the confirmation.
Right. So, and the keeping of the ancestral altar and opening that internal space in you to access those beings, those ancestral entities, that brought you into a place of, let's say, closer proximity with those inherited traumas so that you were able to process them through? Is that?
So I was processing my lived trauma.
Yeah.
And then there's like, you go through so much of processing that, and then it's kind of like, but wait a minute, what the fuck is this?
I see. Yeah.
So it was through identifying the process of processing trauma.
Yeah.
That then with the awareness, I was able to know that it wasn't just my trauma.
Yeah, totally. And I that's great, because I think that's so needful for anyone wanting to do this kind of work, because if you don't sort out your own personal history and your own traumas and hangups and egoic impulses and all that stuff, just at a basic psychological level, it's really difficult to access the deeper ancestral inherited work, because you can't distinguish what's what, right? And there's all kinds of projection that happens. So that's a really important point, I
And
think.
feelings feel like feelings, no matter whose they are.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not like, oh, my daddy's trauma feeling feels different than my pain. Nope, that
Right.
pain still feel like the same pain. You got to bring the mind to the pain.
Yeah, totally, totally. And I think it's also another thing. What you were saying made me think of is, um, there's so much grief that has to be done with this kind of work. And I think one disadvantage that we have, in no matter who we are, just living in a dominator Western social context, one really major disadvantage we have is, in addition to not having the cultural tools to do this stuff, we have to go seek all this out, and it's kind of rarefied, right? But in addition to that, we also are not given basic emotive tools for grief work. Like, people, I mean, if you think about like average, at least white people in this society, I mean, the average response to like losing a loved one or whatever is of, you know, sadness or whatever. And then 3 days later, you're back to work. You don't want to deal with it. Repress that shit because it's just too, you know, all these tropes that we get in American culture, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and all this kind of stuff. That's the kind of attitude that we have been conditioned with. And so there's a profound need to do real grieving. And that's alarming to some people, right? And if you haven't done that basic psychological work and you're not emotionally healthy, then you might not even be able to access some of these deeper threads of the work, because you're so conditioned against being able to actually adequately enter that grief and express it and feel it and work it through. So that's a huge,
Even
hugely
though
important.
what's interesting though is like, that's the water you're swimming in. What I found out is I didn't find the grief that I was trying to avoid was the water I lived my life through. And
Mm-hmm.
then for me, I had to learn more pleasant feeling experiences. Like I had to learn positive feelings instead of shaming them for being weak. So like, in order to have control, I couldn't feel any feelings.
Yeah.
And because I like start behavior rather than stop behavior due to my defiant nature,
Mm-hmm.
um, I would just start trying to experience more pleasant feelings. And then you get a yes to that, right? And then it's like, oh, wait a minute. And then I would find power, not power, but effect that was more conducive to what I wanted, to my intention,
Mm-hmm.
with the positive feelings. And so for me, it's not necessarily a moral thing. It is if these are our goals, this is the way you get there, because this is not clearly this hasn't been the way to get there.
Right. Yeah.
You know how I know? Because we're not there, and this has been the way for a while.
It's been the way to get to a disaster, which is exactly where we are collectively, in a massive, mostly unacknowledged and unprocessed disaster zone. That's basically where we're all standing. And I think, you know, I don't, not to end on a sour note here, because I sense we're probably coming to the close of the conversation, so we can say some other things after this, but I mean, I think with climatological disaster, with racial tensions, with all of these issues that are boiling up now to the surface, or reboiling in some cases, right? The jig is going to be up on a lot of these things, and we're going to come to a point, probably not too long from now, where we're going to realize, you know, this experiment that we thought was headed in some kind of productive direction has hit a wall, and it's at an end. And we're going to realize the profound unsustainability of what we're doing and what we've been doing for centuries. And it won't be a comfortable realization for almost anyone, right? Because most people are so, like we were saying, they're so comfortable in this society, and they're so apathetic, and they're so addicted to their conveniences and their privileges, and just the way that things have unfolded, in this kind of glow, this delusional glow of American exceptionalism and human exceptionalism, anthropocentrism, and all the rest of it, right? And the jig is about to be up on all that stuff, I think. And already people, the cracks are appearing in the walls. Already people are really ill at ease. The thing is that I think most people who aren't equipped to think about these kinds of concepts don't necessarily know why. They just know, man, something's wrong. Things just feel like they're going in a bad direction. And there's this ambiance of, low-level cataclysm. But this road that we've been on cannot go on forever. It just can't. And I think we're probably not that far from reaching a point of real barrier where we just realize, or the reality is forced on us, rather, that we can't go any further with this model of culture and society.
I agree with you, but as a person who doesn't necessarily care for the model the way it is, and as a person who is a Band-Aid ripper, rip that shit off.
Yep.
As far as I'm concerned, it's efficient, right? Tear it all down, we'll build a new one. But I would not necessarily want to be torn down, so there's that.
Right. I agree. Yeah. But I think so one way that I make an analogy here with working in a pastoral capacity and working as a chaplain and a priest, etc., that one of the things I've learned over the years is you never want to deconstruct somebody's worldview without simultaneously replacing it with something that's more life-giving for them. So we do need to just let all this shit fall away, tear it down, stop relying on these outmoded dominator institutions, just let it fall away. But at the same time, those of us who are equipped to do it need to be working really hard to be bringing in this nourishing content, this life-giving content that can go in place of all this horseshit that needs to die. So I think that it needs to be a simultaneous process.
So then, though I do think this will end up being split into a part 1 and part 2, because we are far into, or an hour and a half in. There is hope if we choose to do the work. Now, all this rip the Band-Aid off, tear down the systems and all that doesn't have to be so uncomfortable if people would just say, all right, I hear you. You know what? I value what you're saying. It makes sense. It's resonating with something inside of me. I'm getting all the goosebumps, or maybe, the hair on the back of my neck is standing up. And you know what? You're right. I do need to do this work. I don't know what my culture and heritage is. What can I do? If you do the work, the world will change, right? Like the world is reflected back to us. If we do the work, it'll change. So Brendan, how can they do the work with you? Because of course, I want them in my actively authentic allyship, where Brendan will be co-facilitating a session with Ajabeth, who is my spiritual advisor. Or at least that's what we're thinking. I keep making these promises to the world, and I honestly, we'll see what it is. But how do they work with, say, all right, I'm not ready for Ask Alexis. I'm ready for Brendan. He seems safer. He uses all those words. He has this he seems to validate his knowledge with history. So how do they work with you, Brendan? Yeah.
Well, they should be ready to work with you too, I think. But
the reality is they're not. Not everybody. Now, a lot of people are.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so what I have a number of ways that I work with people. One is to do one-on-one work as a spiritual director. And the term spiritual direction maybe isn't something that's familiar to everyone. So I'll just say a little bit about what that is. It's like a spiritual counselor, but I'm not a licensed clinical psychologist. So I'm a priest, I'm ordained. So I have the authority, socially speaking, to do spiritual care with folks. But that's really the way that I do that work. I'm drawing from all kinds of different things in that work. So I'm drawing from my knowledge base in Western mysticisms and various religious traditions. I'm drawing from my experience as a mystic myself, as a contemplative, from all my work as a priest and being prior of a vowed religious community, etc. So I'm drawing from all those things and just my life experience, and also my study in psychology and in narrative therapy and all that. So it all kind of comes together, and I can guide people under that umbrella of spiritual direction. I can guide folks through a process of really intensive transformation if they're ready for the work. And I try to always meet people where they are and start from where they're at. And there's, basically no case I won't, that I think I can't help with. But also, of course,
no, because there are cases that I feel that way. So it's nice to know I can refer them.
Yeah, you can refer, but I mean also sometimes people need multiple folks working with them at the same time from different angles. So that's a given, but yeah. Then also I teach. So I teach now in COVID land. I teach online, and I'm in fact launching some new courses through my website, which is brendanelliswilliams.com.
We'll put that in the comments.
Okay, yeah. So I'm launching some new courses coming up pretty soon. One 1st of September, one 15th of September. One is a course that's in basically Celtic folklore and myth, and asking how those things can relate to our contemporary reclamation of ancestral inheritance and to living more sustainably on the land, issues of ecology, questions around meaning, existential questions. So what can we draw from these ancient mythic and folkloric traditions and practices and customs to inform our pursuit of answers to those questions? Then the other course is a 5-month course. The first course is only 4 weeks. The second one is 5 months, and it's a course on animism or animistic spirituality, which is, in brief, it's the worldview which acknowledges that everything in the natural creation is alive, and everything has a soul or a consciousness, and we can and should relate to all those things that are in our environment. So how do we do that? And how do we do that in a way that's not culturally appropriative? And how do we do that in a way that is moral, ethical, and that actually integrates into our contemporary lifestyles? So that's that course. And then folks should just kind of pay attention, because I mean, that sounds weird, but hey, pay attention. No, I don't mean it that way, but I mean, just watch out for things that I'm doing, because I've got a lot of stuff in the mix, a lot of stuff brewing right now. So, and also folks can and should, if they feel so inclined, read my book, which deals with some of the issues that we talked about today. And it's called it's called Seeds from the Wild Verge: Myth, Nature, and Theology in the Border Stream of Celtic Wisdom. And you can buy it on Amazon and wherever. I think it's probably, I don't know what's happened with the distribution, but I think it's probably available on Barnes and Noble and other stuff like that now. But it's definitely on Amazon. And if you don't want to support Amazon, or you don't want to support big business like that online, you can contact me and I can get you a copy of the book directly too. So
how they can contact you on Facebook or on social media?
Yeah,
You through your
Facebook
website
or through email. So on my website, there's a contact page. That's a really easy way to get in touch with me, and folks can contact me there for any questions or if they're desiring to find out more about a course or any of that.
Go ahead and give them the website one more time.
Okay, it's BrendanEllisWilliams.com, all one word, BrendanEllisWilliams.com.
Okay, just because some people aren't going to check the comments or anything like
Yeah,
that.
sure.
And so I just want to say thank you so much, first, for acknowledging history the way that I've learned history, for making sure we know that Christ is not Jesus's last name, and that it is a power, and that the Bible, King James Bible, not so accurate. For that alone, Brendan, you get invited to the cookout, and maybe I'll tell you what that means after we get off the call. Sorry. So I just want to, we're going to separate this. I just want to make sure I thank Brendan for all of his knowledge and for being willing to give us so much knowledge that we have to make 2 parts. So Brendan, do you have anything to say to the Ask Alexis audience?
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in and being part of the conversation, even though indirectly, perhaps. But and just thank you so much, Alexis, for having me and for having a great discussion together.
Yeah, this was awesome. I am thoroughly excited. And last thing I want to say, heal your ancestors so we can have a shared future. It's just what's necessary. All you got to do is decide to commit. They'll take care of the rest.
Amen.